Okay, and hello everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. Today is September 27th, and we are recording episode number 440, and we'll be talking about what's new with SAP and Azure. We'll get into why it's an and, not an on Azure in just a little bit, with our special guest, Holger Bruchelt. I'm joined by Russell. The rest of the crew is off doing whatever they're doing today, having fun. I think, Russell, let's go ahead and get into the news. You want to start first?
Yeah, thanks. Not a great deal of news to cover today. There were a couple of things that I think one of them you picked out as well. But just starting with NetApp files, there's been some general availability announcement around new regions and some cross-region replication features as well have been switched off. So as far as the new regions go, Korea South and Sweden Central have now got NetApp files. And for the replication side of it, we've got Korea Central and Korea South, North Central US, East US 2, France Central and Western Europe. And I think earlier in the week, there was also an announcement about the backup feature being put out in public preview. And that public preview now expanded into Southeast Asia and UK South. I'll let you cover the one about unmanaged disk being retired.
Yeah, this is sort of a funny one. I remember when I've been doing Azure for a long time, and when we first started, it was unmanaged disks, and all kinds of problems with unmanaged disks, right? There's ways that you could set it up that would sort of break yourself into jail and performance issues, and so we released managed disks, which I didn't realize way back in 2017. But we just announced the other day that in September of 2025, unmanaged disks are going to be retired. So you need to migrate. To be honest, unless there's some technical blocker, you should migrate way before that. There's lots of really good performance and technical and resiliency reasons to be on managed disks versus unmanaged disks. So highly encourage people to do that. But yeah, post September in 2025, which is coming up faster than it sounds, definitely want to make sure you're migrated by then, because I think at that point we'll force migrate you at that point.
I thought it was crazy to think that managed disks have been around now since 2017. That's quite. I remember the announcement, and it seems like only yesterday. So.
I mean, I remember when we were building it, and we were really trying to get out of some of the problems that unmanaged disks have, and so I think, God, it's probably, I don't even know exactly when, but it's probably been 2 or 3 years where it's the default in the portal, and it's default through CLI and whatnot these days. So you really have to work hard to create new stuff. So I suspect this is mostly older machines that people have just never had any issues with. But again, I think it's well worth the move. It's definitely worth it from a resiliency perspective for sure. Cool. Well, at this point, let's shift over to SAP on Azure.
Just before we do, because I'm quite excited about Microsoft Ignite, which is coming up.
I know that's right. What's that? Next couple of weeks, right?
It's October the 12th to 14th.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a great event. It's where we showcase a lot of the latest technology and innovations and stuff, and partners are there as well. But really good. And this year we're following the kind of hybrid transformation for most of our.
I saw that. That's nice to see.
So as well as the global digital event, there's some in-person stuff going on, and in the UK this year it's going to happen in Manchester. So again, really, it's a great place to hold events. Nice place to go, and to have that in-person element, I think it's really exciting. And I think we're doing the same thing in France, Germany, Latin America, Japan, and China as well. So
nice.
Get yourself registered if you haven't already, and go along to that.
It's nice to see. I mean, again, it's nice to see the hybrid model really taking shape, because again, everybody's got different circumstances, and not to mention that just the inability to travel used to always be a problem with these conferences, right? You couldn't get the travel budget, or you couldn't, coordinate the travel, and now the ability to see both. But if you're in a position where you want to go in person, it's nice to be able to have that option, right? So it's nice to see for sure. For sure. Cool. Excellent. Well, cool. Well, Holger, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do here at Microsoft?
Yeah, thank you, Evan, Russell. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Holger Bruchelt. I'm a program manager here at Microsoft for SAP integration. So basically, I'm in a team that is very much focusing on everything related to SAP. So whether it's then how to run an SAP system on Azure, how to integrate an SAP system with multiple Azure solutions, how to connect an SAP system to Azure. So it's all about the integration of Microsoft services with SAP. And that's actually funny that you talked about managed disk, because I joined Microsoft around 5 years ago. So for me, managed disk was just a new thing that was there,
Yeah.
which was obviously really, really interesting. And I mean, I came from SAP. I've been almost 15 years at SAP, and then I switched to Microsoft, and it was really, really interesting to see the new capabilities popping up in Azure and really using them.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been a journey for sure. I think one of the things we were talking about this before the show. Excuse me. We when you and I were first talking about the show, we said, hey, let's talk about SAP and Azure, or I'm sorry, on Azure, and you corrected me and said, no. These days we need, we should really be talking about Azure. And so two questions. One, why is the and important? And two, I should know this, but I don't. Can SAP run? Does it run in other clouds as well? I mean, I know you can run it on-prem, but so tell me about this story. Like, why are we sort of pushing the and model at this point?
Yeah, perfect. So when I started, I started as a global black belt at Microsoft, and whenever I talked to customers, it was always about how can I run my SAP system on Azure. So it was really
the infrastructure piece, basically.
Exactly,
Yeah.
the infrastructure piece. So you have to keep in mind, SAP, they have this in-memory database called SAP HANA, and then all of a sudden we're talking about terabytes of memory, and this is really really important. So we're not terabyte of disk size, which obviously we have, but really terabyte of memory. And again, 5 years ago, we had the G series, which had 0.5 terabyte of memory, which was great. It was certified for SAP workload, so you could really run it. SAP would create support, would support the whole thing. So that was the main play. Can we run it? Is it secure? Is it safe? And stuff like that. That was the main questions that we had. And in the meantime, this has completely changed. So first of all, when I talk to a lot of customers, security, so running your SAP system on Azure is actually a benefit. They really see, well, all the security investments that we have on Azure, this is not something that your average customer can do on premises. So for them, it's an asset to move an SAP system to Azure now. And similarly, when we look at the virtual machines, I mean, G series are long gone. I still remember a very nice video.
I think you could provision one, but yeah, I don't know if anybody does.
I don't
anymore.
know. Yeah, but just think of it. And this was 0.5 terabyte. And if we look now, there's this beautiful video from Mark Rusinovich where he was playing Tetris in the performance monitor of a machine that had, like, I don't know how many cores and 24 terabytes of memory. So really memory. So the question whether you can run SAP on Azure is long answered. Of course you can. We have smaller customers. We have huge customers that run their workload on these enormous virtual machines, and so that's all there. And that's actually now to answer your other question. That's obviously something where other hyperscalers are also trying to get bigger virtual machines and stuff like that. I actually think we're still unique when it comes to the 24 terabytes virtual machines. But even then, there are other customers. Well, why should I put my SAP system on Azure? And that's, I think, where we now really change the whole discussion to say, well, it's not only about running your SAP system on Azure, but what are the things that you can do on top of that? And this is, for me, really the most exciting thing, and where we really see that Azure PaaS services, like an Azure Monitor or Microsoft Sentinel for SAP solutions, for example, where we really look at securing your SAP environment, or Azure Backup for SAP. We have these native solutions on Azure that customers can just switch on. Maybe they need to configure some things, and then they can leverage these capabilities also within their SAP environment. And that's only the start of the story, I would say. But that's really one of the reasons why we have started to switch our narrative from SAP on Azure to actually SAP and Azure, or SAP and Microsoft, because there's so many things that you can do once you run your SAP system on Azure, actually.
This sort of reminds me of, so it almost sounds like the model we used to see where, I mean, there's, Microsoft's a big, huge company, and, we've got lots of different pieces, but, and there's part of it is the infrastructure, right? We obviously want to sell the infrastructure and get those meters running. But, there's Power BI, there's Azure ML, there's Data Factory, like there's all these, like
Yes.
we're sort of, part of our business is these other pieces, and we want those to work with everything. Right. And it sounds like, so we're sort of bringing SAP into the fold of the broader ecosystem instead of this separate thing. Is that the right way to think about it?
Absolutely. And absolutely. And one thing that I think explains this in a really amazing way is a product that we just announced in public preview called Azure Center for SAP Solutions. So if you go to your Azure portal now, in the past, what you could do is you could search for a virtual machine or for networking or storage or whatever. And then with the virtual machine, you could start and stop it, for example. Or you had a CLI to let's create a virtual machine, which is good. I mean, that's the foundation basically. But now with Azure Center for SAP Solution, we're basically making Azure SAP aware. So all of a sudden, Azure knows that this is an SAP system, which has some really, really cool things. So first of all, I can now tell Azure, deploy an SAP system, and it will deploy the required virtual machines. It will deploy the managed disk. It will deploy the networking,
all that stuff.
Exactly, and in a way that is officially supported by Microsoft. So following our reference architectures for SAP, and following the required IOPS and throughput parameters, and then you have an SAP system up and running. And then the other thing, which might sound not too exciting, but actually, if you think of it, you can also say, start my SAP system or stop my SAP system, which is really important because in an SAP system, you have a database, you have application service and stuff like that. And obviously you need to first start the database before you start the application service. And these simple things that now Azure knows your SAP system. With this, it also knows SAP metadata. So all of a sudden you can query, you can run a custom query and ask, look, what application service do I have? Or if we go down to really the architecture of an SAP system, what are central instances that I have installed in my SAP system? And Azure knows all of this now. So this is something where I think we're just getting started, but already now it's really, really excited to see what customers and what also other teams are doing with this.
But my team have been talking for a while now about things like what we call cross-solution plays. So it's taking something like Azure Synapse Analytics and being able to look at the data that's stored within SAP, or maybe take some of the data that's in SAP and use it with the cognitive services APIs and SDKs to try and do some simple AI or to get some more insight and do some stuff with it. Is that now surfaced, or will it be surfaced in a way that you can query an SAP type connector rather than just connect to a database? How does that level of integration work?
We're not there yet, but I mean, without
you heard the yet there, Russell.
Yeah. So no, but Russell, I mean, without going too much into detail, that's one of the potential visions that we have in mind that we might develop in this direction, because as you said, now Azure knows these are the connection details. So when we are looking at an Azure Data Factory, or when we're looking at a Logic app or something like that, and we need to connect from these tools to an SAP system, now we have the information available. And actually, if we look at something like Azure Monitor or Azure Backup, that's already where we are going, that Azure Backup knows now, oh, there's an SAP system. So if I want to back up your SAP system, then I can query Azure or the resource provider to get me the relevant information. And then Azure Backup knows, okay, this is a HANA database. For this, obviously, I need to do the HANA backup. This is the application server. So before maybe updating this one, maybe I'll shut it down and do an offline backup. Or so Azure Backup now can query the resource provider to really get all the relevant information to do what it's supposed to do. And similar, obviously, with Azure Monitoring, with Microsoft Sentinel. So that's already the first step where we empower these different Azure services to know SAP, to query, get the relevant information, so that you as the end user, the administrator, don't need to type in all the information. Well, it's all on Azure, so Azure should know. And now Azure knows. Now Azure can actually provide you with this information. So I think we're just getting started. Right now you can start and stop, but the potential.
I guess I'm thinking more around away from the system admin side of it, which I can see it helps with the administration and the complexity and removing that a little bit. But I'm thinking more from the user's perspective, where SAP, obviously it's a lot of line of business and stuff that runs your business, stuff that runs and looks after everything. That the data and the processes in there, if you could put Power Platform around that and build your own Power Apps that can automate it, get insight from it, and then hook into other systems that you've got, whether they're on-premise or in the cloud, and that becomes really powerful then. So that kind of level of business connectivity, is that also on the roadmap, or am I getting too ahead of myself?
No, let's see what comes in the next few months and years, I would say. But yeah, I mean, for me, this is really, now that Azure has access to this information, the opportunities are endless, I would say. So okay. It's really, that's exactly where we have already some visions. Obviously, we need to, there's a lot of development still required, but that's certainly something where we see a huge value add. If, as you said, the Power Platform, Power Apps would now, I mean, we have so many customers that want to integrate Power Apps with SAP, and now for them, well, potentially Power Apps would know, okay, look, you have these 5 SAP systems. Maybe 3 of them are your productive system. There's a development system for HR. Do you want to connect to this system? So the whole user experience can completely change, because at the moment, and I'm getting a little ahead of this because I also wanted to talk about Power Platform specifically, but right now it's always, there's the Microsoft user and there's the SAP user, and they not always talk to each other. So there's always this disconnect. With something like ACSS, so Azure Center for SAP Solution, ACSS, we can make this connection much easier. So I think there's, again, we're just getting started with this one, but I see we already now have so many ideas what we can do there next. So there'll be some really cool integrations coming up.
For those of you that are listening and aren't looking, he looks super excited as he's talking about this. Holger, you just see the smile on Holger's face as all these ideas are going through his head. So I'm sure. It almost sounds like, and I don't want to sort of sort of reduce the scope of this, but I mean, it almost sounds like you're headed down a path where I can treat SAP as a PaaS type thing, right? Obviously, there's a whole lot more complexity, but that's the whole point of PaaS, is I don't have to, manage and deal with some of the complexity. I can say things like turn on my SAP system. Is that, again, it's not a one-to-one, but is that conceptually sort of where you guys are trying to go with this and make it so it is that easy to manage and connect to and use?
I would think we're doing the first step. I mean, managing an SAP system is much more than just starting and stopping the SAP
Absolutely.
system.
Yeah.
There are system service providers that we're working with, so global GSIs and even SAP, who are really offering a managed SAP service where they not only make sure that it runs, but they also update and control it and whatever. But I would say we're doing the first step, and actually we're working with a lot of GSIs and smaller partners that are using now ACSS to support them in their journey of managing an SAP system, because all of a sudden now it's much easier for them to deploy. We have partners that threw away their installation scripts and they are now betting on ACSS. They are enhancing the deployment story with their specific things, but they can basically get rid of 80% of the mundane, boring code that just takes care of how do I deploy the system, how do I make sure that it's set up according to the recommendations from SAP and Microsoft. We're taking all of this away, and they can really focus on what's really crucial, and that's how do I manage the SAP system? How do I
what's
run
my
it?
Value
how do
add? Really,
exactly.
At that point, instead of the sort of the create the machine, turn on the machine, like move to the stuff that's actually high value. Nice. Yeah, that makes sense.
I really love all this stuff that takes something that is essentially a black box to me at the moment. It's a really complex environment, SAP. I don't really want to go near it or touch it. If you can break those barriers down and just expose the bits that I can need to talk to it without me, worrying about breaking it, that's all for the better. And one of the things that we see with the PaaS services, and when something like SQL came to Azure, we got better with the things like RBAC and identity and how we integrate with Azure AD. And you mentioned users in SAP, not necessarily talking to users on Azure. Is that something that's coming as well soon? Is it integrated managed identity or something like that?
Well, SAP still has their own user management engine or identity management, but actually we are working, and that is also one of the work that we're working with the Azure Active Directory team very closely with, to integrate Azure Active Directory with SAP's identity management solution. So we already have a lot of scenarios where customers start in Teams, for example, or they start with an SAP user interface, but then using the same identities on Azure Active Directory, they can now easily connect these two systems with each other, so that, I don't know, we're starting in Teams and you want to access your SAP system. Since both these systems are connected to Azure Active Directory, now you can have an easy single sign-on. Or if you're starting from an SAP user interface, very often we have these SAP Fiori user interface, so a web-based, browser-based application. And now you can also use this to log on with Azure Active Directory. And obviously, once you're authenticated also with Azure Active Directory, you can easily call the Microsoft Graph to retrieve some document information or something like that. So that's where the world is really, really coming closer together.
Sounds like you've got a really big backlog.
Oh, we do. And actually, I mean, this is still very much infrastructure focused, I would say, how to operate, how to run an SAP system. And the thing that we're now doing is also we're going one level up, basically. So you mentioned Azure Data Factory, for example, where we have dedicated connectors that allow you to connect to an SAP system, to retrieve information from the SAP system. And we just released a new connector called the Azure or the SAP CDC Change Data Capture connector that allows you to connect easily to an SAP system and really not only do a bulk upload or transfer of the data, but where you can really look, what are the deltas? What are the sales orders that have been created the last time I queried the SAP system or something like that? So you can really easily get this data then out of the SAP system. And we have a lot of cool customers that are now using then with Azure Synapse, that are using Azure ML services on top of the data that enrich this with data that is coming from a Cosmos DB or from IoT data platforms that then build a nice Power BI dashboard on top of this to really visualize the data. So even there, we really help customers with the end-to-end story, not only extracting the data, but really getting the data, massaging the data, working with the data, and then visualizing the data. And now actually with the Power Platform, we're also allowing them to what we call insight to actions, that they see, oh, something is wrong with the data, or there's something really strange, and now they want to update the information in the SAP system. That's also now possible with an integration of the Power Platform, for example. So we really have this full end-to-end story now covered to really help customers that run SAP and Microsoft.
That's nice. It is, the SQL on a VM has a similar scenario where you can deploy it. There's a SQL RP, a SQL resource provider that helps manage it. But one of the things we had to do was allow you to add this after a deployment has already happened. With the SAP, I want to get the name right, the SAP Connection
Center for SAP
Center
Solution.
Yeah, that one. Can I take this resource provider and apply it to an existing SAP deployment? Does it fix the things that I broke? Like if I'd love to be able to use that if I've already got a deployment, I assume.
So first of all, yes, we call it register. So if you have an existing SAP system, you can register it with ACSS, which obviously is really important because we have so many. Luckily, we have so many customers in the meantime that run SAP on Azure.
Yeah.
And obviously, we also want to help them. So if you're saying, well, I've already installed my SAP system, or maybe I'm saying, well, look, my installation scripts are so great, I don't need what ACSS is offering me. Then great. Then continue to use your own scripts. But you can still register this existing SAP system with ACSS. And what we can do now is we have, for example, one thing that we're working on. My colleague Philip Leitenbauer is there. They're really much involved. They developed a quality check tool, which is really cool because this tool now can use the information from ACSS and check how is the system set up. So are the disks
almost
exactly just to validate and see is everything still there. So maybe you did make some mistake, or maybe we came up with a new recommendation and saying, well, in the past, P10 disks were great, but now actually P15 is much better, or premium V2 disks are better. Then we can also provide this recommendation to the user, and then really use it to connect these systems together. So I think this validation is something that is really cool.
You know what you're doing here, Holger. You're making because I live on the broken side of the world. You're making my life harder because you're removing the easy things, like your disk is missized, your VM is missized, and now it's going to be the really hard stuff. Thanks. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, just one last question from my side. The way the world's going, we don't want to necessarily be polling, extracting data, then doing some insights and then acting on it. We want to know when stuff happens instantly and trigger a workflow based off that. So how can we plug into triggers on SAP? Is that something that's doable as well? So if you think about event-driven application programming, somebody does something, creates a new record SAP. Okay, I want to then provision something in SharePoint, or I want to go off and do something elsewhere.
So I think we can definitely look at these events and take actions out of this. So we know when an SAP system is created. We know when we run this validation, the quality check, we can take actions out of this and perform something. So since ACSS is really part of the resource provider of Azure, we really embed with all the different functionalities that we have there. So this is really when it comes from an Azure infrastructure perspective. Right. When we go again higher up the chain and we're looking at events from an SAP system, for example, that's also where we have a really cool integration now between Azure Event Grid, so our eventing service, and SAP's Event Mesh solution. So if you create a purchase order, if you create if there's an invoice created, or if an employee moves within the organization or something like that, that's where we can now also capture these events and pass these events over to Event Grid, Azure Event Grid, and then obviously we're in the Microsoft world, so then you can trigger off a Logic app, you can trigger off a Power app or whatever. So that's where we can really also have this event-driven integrations between the SAP world and the Microsoft world.
Yeah, that's great. I can see that, joiners and leavers for companies, part of the process. If you're provisioning users within SAP as part of that process, and then they come and leave the company, you delete them out your Active Directory, but they're still in SAP. All that kind of tidy up. That'd be brilliant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was just in our security training for this month, Russell. I don't know if you've taken it yet, but I just, at least in my organization, we just had to take it, and it talks about, when people leave, you make sure you gotta take their permissions, away. So, yeah, I mean, Holger, this is great. Appreciate you coming on. I think I do want to call out for our audience that, you're actually, I think you mentioned before the show, you are a listener, but you're also a fellow podcaster as well. You have one that's focused on SAP, correct?
Correct. So myself and two colleagues, Goran Kondric and Robert Boban, we are also running our own video podcast it's still called SAP on Azure, but actually more and more we're also transitioning to SAP and Azure, but that's where we also always try to have weekly updates on everything related to SAP and Microsoft, I would say.
Yeah, we'll put the link to your show out, because, again, I think this is a great resource for anybody that's doing this, right? I mean, you guys are the experts on it, and you know what this really takes to be successful. So any last thoughts you want to leave the audience with? I think we talked about a lot of great things today.
Oh, absolutely. The only thing that I would re-emphasize what Russell started in the beginning, make sure to watch Microsoft Ignite. There might be some cool things coming up there.
No, there's no foreshadowing there or anything.
There's some SAP related some things. Great. That's
maybe. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Great. Well, Holger, thanks for coming on. Russell, always good to see you. We'll talk to everybody later. Bye now.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
Thank you.